Hello, welcome back to Sailor Space. I'm so elated to have you back on board. It's a beautiful session this week, and we're going to learn some interesting topic once more. Meanwhile, there's a new innovation on YouTube, so you don't have to type Sailor Space International Navigators Hub all the time to search for my videos. You can just type at Sailor Space 01. That's my YouTube handle to take you to my videos. So, as promised, this week we'll continue our topic on piston cooling. Last week I talked about piston cooling. Why do we need to do piston cooling? If we don't have piston cooling, what is supposed to happen? What are the disadvantages and advantages of piston cooling, if you would say? So today I will be talking on, we'll still continue on piston cooling, but we'll be considering how this cooling process is achieved on medium speed engine or high speed engine, the smaller engines, and on larger two-stroke slow speed engines. How do we achieve piston cooling on the four-stroke engines, which are mostly the medium speed and the high speed engines, and on the two-stroke engines, which are mostly the large crosshead slow speed engines. So we'll be considering the smaller engines first. While we're considering piston cooling in small and big engines, we can call them large engines, the main factor to be considered is their design and the material used for the piston. Now imagine a small engine and a big engine. If you need to lift up a very heavy block right now, you need more power. And for it to achieve that power, you either use a lifting machine, or as a human being, you have to bring somebody that has lots of strength. And for that human being that has a lot of strength, that human being has to eat a lot of food to complement the strength that is needed to lift that equipment. Now, if I want to lift a very small equipment like a cup or a book from a table, or just push a small block, I wouldn't need much strength. So even without eating, or eating very small, I can actually move that thing. So now let's use this illustration to compare with piston material in relation to piston cooling. Now, when you have a small engine, the heat that is dissipated at the end of every combustion is very small, not as compared to heat that is dissipated at the end of combustion in a large engine. So for that reason, it will mean that more fuel is being burnt for the bigger engines, and when more fuel is being burnt, more heat is being released and more cooling is being needed. Now for the smaller engine, it reduces fuel, reduce heat, and the cooling is not as hectic as when it comes to the large engines, that's the large two-stroke engines. Now, for the piston design of the smaller engines, it must have thicker materials for the piston crowns and the piston walls. This is to aid thermal conductivity, because conduction is the main method of removing heat from the piston of smaller engines. Although there is radiation, but it's very small, more like sometimes negligible. The main cooling is achieved by conduction. Now let's talk a little on this. How is this piston for the smaller engine cooled by radiation? It occurs, okay, let's go this way. Normally, in an engine, we have cooling around your cylinder liner, and they are mostly cooled by fresh water. As the cylinder liner is being cooled, the temperature is being reduced. So slightly by radiation of the heat can be radiated to the nearby cylinder liners that are being cooled. by the water circulation. But this is actually the effect is actually very small, because the heat flow from the walls, from the piston crown, being right. When you talk about radiation, it means the two surfaces are not in contact with each other. Remember basic convection with radiation and convection. Convection having to do with two liquid radiation, two surfaces are not in contact but they exchange heat. While conduction has to be two solid materials in contact. So now the heat from the piston crown, where the larger amount of heat is generated, to the lower side of the piston walls is being taken away, partly, not all, through the cylinder jacket by radiation. And this cylinder, meanwhile the cylinder liner is in turn cooled by water. But the main method of cooling in the four-stroke engine, that the smaller engines, is by oil splashing. Now, for four-stroke engines, there is no stuffing box that divides the combustion chamber. It's an open space between the crankcase and the combustion chamber. So as the crankshaft rotates during operation of the engine, oil is being splashed into the underside of the piston. Now, as this oil splashes, oil has functions of lubrication, cleaning, and cooling. So you see, the oil that is splashed onto the underside of the piston now removes a very large amount of heat by conduction. Now, that is the main method of cooling for smaller engines. So let's move on to the larger engines. So for the larger engines, the cooling is more necessary because more fuel is being burnt, more power generated, definitely more heat is generated, and we have to maintain the piston within a temperature that it does not rise to a point where the strength of the piston is actually reduced, which can lead to failure of the material. And also, construction of the piston is brought into play here, because for large engines, it has cooling space. It has spaces where coolant passes through, either water or oil, whichever choice of coolant that is being used for the engine. It has cooling space. Now, remember, for the smaller engine, it needed thicker walls for conduction, thermal conductivity. Now that we have spaces in which the coolant passes through to cool the engine, if the walls of the pistons are thick, the exchange in heat may not really be very effective. So in this case, those kinds of engine has thinner walls. The walls are thinner, the piston crown is very thin also. But instead, an internal rib is actually used to support the piston crown, more like a wedge to support it because of the thin design of the piston crown. But for this particular large engines, for cooling to be effective, the piston design has to have thinner walls and thinner piston crown to achieve that cooling. So now we have cooling passages. These passages have cooling means either oil or water, and they are connected to either their tank, the water tank for piston cooling, or the oil tank for piston cooling, through telescopic pipes. That's telescopic pipes, pipes that are movable. Now, pistons moves up and down the combustion space, top dead center to bottom dead center. If we use a fixed pipe, it will not get it. So telescopic pipes are used, pipes that are movable in some extent, not like it will be moving as if does not have support. Pipes that are moving in some extent to achieve this. So you see that the fluid now goes in through the underside of the piston, like the lower side, the lower side of the piston. Why do this fluid have to go through the lower side of the piston, because the piston crown is the hottest part of the piston, while the lower side of the piston has a very low temperature. Now, this when the means of cooling, that's either oil or water, passes through the underside of the piston, it will absorb the heat from the lower side of the piston. It absorbs the heat, it cools the lower side. The temperature of the lower side is within limit. It cools it and it keeps going up. By the time it reaches the piston crown that has a very high temperature, you see that the fluid is not very cold. It will have some level of heat within it. And you see that heat will now prevent the piston crown from shock. Now, if the cooling actually starts from the piston crown, which is the hottest part of the piston, with that part being the hottest, in contact with cold water, there may be a very high amount of expansion, rapid expansion, and that rapid expansion may lead to shock on the material that can eventually lead to crack and damage the piston. That is why the piston coolant has to pass through the lower part. As it's going, it absorbs the heat gradually. The fluid, the coolant itself becomes a bit hot, not like very hot, has a bit rise, a warm, an increase in temperature, like it becomes warm. So as it reaches the hottest part, which is the piston crown, the two temperature can relate itself without causing damages to the engine. For effective cooling to happen in the piston, the heat transmission and the heat absorption is governed by the difference in temperature across the piston section. And now when the difference in temperatures becomes excessively much, it can cause a problem to the piston, like shock, and that can lead to crack, as I explained. Now, this is the same reason why the coolant has to exit in close proximity to the crown. I mean, in close area, close limits to the crown. Some people may say, why do the coolant have to exit? That's leave the cooling space in close proximity to the crown. Some people may ask, why do the coolant have to enter the piston from the lower part? It's the same reason. Simply, the top part of the piston has the hottest temperature after combustion. Now, the temperature gradient, as we discussed earlier on, increases as the crown thickness increases. Now, when the coolant comes from the lower part of the piston, which is the less hot part, it picks up the warm. As it keeps going up, it cools those parts, absorb their heat. It keeps going with the heat. On it reaching the piston crown area, the coolant has some heat, some warm. It has gained some heat, and the temperature difference, or you can say temperature gradient, is not too much, so it can cool it safely without causing shock that can lead to crack and other problems in the engine, and thereabout will have effective thermal efficiency. Now, another reason why it is so is to prevent air or vapor lock in the cooling space. You know, any space that does not have, that is void, has a tendency of having air in it. So when the coolant starts from the underside, it ensures that the cooling space is always filled up, always, to prevent air lock underneath the piston, which will eventually reduce the heat transfer. So that is what we have for this week. I hope you enjoyed today's session. Please remember to subscribe Like, comment, and share. Sharing is caring. I remain your host, Engineer Dorcas Jonah. See you some other time. Remain safe.